Alright, if you're watching this video, I'm going to assume that you already care at least a little bit about online privacy. So you probably don't need to be convinced why Google tracking your every step on Google Maps is a bad thing, or that Facebook knowing so much about you that it can influence the course of elections just by serving you targeted ads is a bad thing. You probably already know that online privacy is important, but even among some privacy-conscious people, you might not be convinced why telemetry is such a bad thing. So, a while ago I made this video about how to remove telemetry from Microsoft's Visual Studio Code application, and I got a couple of comments just asking, why is disabling telemetry important? Like, what's really wrong with allowing a little bit of Microsoft telemetry? So the way all these developers word it is, oh, we just want to know a little bit about you just in order to help us fix bugs or fix crash errors, that sort of thing. So most telemetry is just sending a report of your computer and what you were doing, your operating system, all those different kinds of things whenever some bug happens, just so that the developers can better fix things. It's just easier for them to know exactly what went wrong, and so they can fix it more easily. And on the surface, this doesn't sound like a bad thing at all. Okay, they'll probably put in some sob story too about, oh, how we need to help the developers, or maybe we need to get analytics so that we can get funding for our project. And of course, that all sounds very sad, and you'll probably just click accept because you feel bad for them. And maybe they'll even mention that the data is completely anonymized. They can't tie it back to your personal data. And so you might be thinking, okay, this doesn't sound like a big deal at all. I'll just allow telemetry everywhere. But for me, I disable telemetry everywhere, and let me just tell you why. So especially for these big, giant, closed source applications from companies like Microsoft, okay, the Visual Studio Code that they advertise is open source, but it's just marketing mumbo jumbo because the finished product or the application or the binaries that they give you are not open source. They are closed source, and they have been filled with a bunch of Microsoft branding and telemetry. And just using the base product, you can't even disable all the telemetry. Somebody else would have to compile all the code and not put in the Microsoft branding and telemetry in order to make it telemetry free. Now, like I said, you might not see any problem with this because it's just helping the developers make a better product. And Microsoft might say that they're only collecting so much information about you. But that's the thing, with these closed source applications and these big companies, you really just have to take them at their word. You really have to trust that the Microsoft developers and everybody all the way up the chain, marketing directors, all these different people, you have to believe that all of these people have your best interests in heart and that they're not going to do anything nefarious with your information. It doesn't matter even if it starts out with the best of intentions. Say they only want to collect the absolute necessary data, but all it takes is for one person to say, we can make a little bit more money if we were collecting just a little bit more information. And if you really think they're going to care about you and what's important to you more than their bottom line of making money, well, you got another thing coming. But like I said, a lot of these companies, they just anonymize all the data. So what's wrong with that? Even if they collect some information that I might not want to share with them, it doesn't really matter because they can't tie it back to me, right? Well, the thing is about this telemetry, they can create a very specific fingerprint about you specifically without even collecting any of your personal information. So if I was an application on your computer taking telemetry, there's a lot of different variables that I could phone back home to Microsoft. So I can phone back your operating system, the hardware you're running it on, the version of the operating system you're running. If you're running a web browser, I can tell which one, which browser add-ons you have installed, the version of which browser you're running, the resolution of your screen, and so many different small variables that when you add up all these variables, it leaves you with very little room for error, and that these companies can actually de-anonymize this data using all these different variables like this. So there's so many different variables that they can pick up that they can actually de-anonymize it to you without even collecting any personal information on you. And all of these companies collect so much data on you, and they pass it back and forth. They kind of share all of this information to make an even more complete picture of you. And so they can cross-reference with different sources, Facebook, Microsoft, Google, all of these companies. They just collude together to create a more perfect picture of you. And they most definitely can track you through even anonymized data. just by de-anonymizing it with all the techniques that I described. You just take a whole bunch of very specific information. Like me, I run a very specific computer setup that is probably not very hard to track me down if you want to. You can look at my time zone and my specific operating version, and you can narrow it down to just me pretty easily. This is not some weird conspiracy theory. This has been done. It's not very difficult to de-anonymize data if you know what you're doing. If you really want to look into this more, you can look up the New York City taxi cab dataset that was released. So the New York City taxi cabs released this completely anonymized data set, and data scientists were able to take this data and basically see who was taking which taxi cab to where. They could even track down if celebrities gave a tip or something like that. And of course, this is without anybody's real name or anything. They can just take all these different variables together and just figure out that it's you fairly easily. Of course, these companies have hundreds of millions of dollars to spend on making their data analysis more and more fine-grained. So if you think they're not going to do this, you're very naive. And like I said, you just have to trust them that they're only taking the data that they absolutely need to make their application better and not anything else. And so that is way too big of a leap of trust for me. I don't trust these companies at all, so why would I trust them with only taking the telemetry that they actually need? And so even for one kind of small program in the whole Microsoft ecosystem, I'm sure they collect much more information from somebody running Windows 10 than just somebody running Visual Studio Code. But I really don't want to help them at all. Even these small data sets can be used to cross-correlate these with other data sets. So it's all interconnected if you really think about it. And so that's why I don't want to give them any information at all about me. So of course I'm going to disable telemetry for these big company products. And so maybe for these big companies like Microsoft, Facebook, and Google, okay, you can kind of understand why you wouldn't want to give them telemetry. But I've heard from other people like, okay, but maybe for something that you trust more, like Mozilla Firefox, why don't you give them telemetry? So for sure, Mozilla Firefox is a lot more trustworthy than somebody like Google or Facebook or Microsoft. I mean, their whole business is predicated on the fact that they protect users' privacies, at least they claim to. And so if they were to go and just throw that all away one day, that wouldn't really make much sense from them. And there's even a page on Mozilla's website where they share all the telemetry that they collect. And you can go there and see everything that they know. And so on a case-to-case basis, I could see the argument for maybe trusting Mozilla Firefox or any other small company like this that might really just have your best interest at heart. But for me, to be honest, that's just another step of faith that I have to have in these companies. So I do have to trust them that even on this public page where they have all this information, I do have to trust them that that's all the data that they collect. I don't know if there's any other data that they might have that they're not disclosing, and I don't want to attribute evil or malice to them, but people can just make mistakes as well. So they don't necessarily have to be evil. They could just make some very human mistake and then accidentally collect more than they need. And I don't really want to put my faith in the fact that I hope that they won't mess up and cause some error that will collect data like that. I don't really want to have to put the trust in them that that won't happen. You might call me paranoid, and this is up to you if you really want to go as far as I do. But Mozilla has done in the past a few privacy questionable things as well. They bought up this company called Pocket that does actually collect your private information. So Pocket, it'll collect URLs. You can put different URLs. Maybe you want to read a blog post in the future, and you can put it in this application called Pocket and save it online. But Pocket does actually collect your information. They are able to see all of the URLs and pages that you put in there, and they are able to tie it back to you. It's not anonymous at all, but it's not directly tied to Firefox. Like, it's not Firefox collecting the data. It's still a third party technically, but Firefox does add a little button to sign up for Pocket in a very obvious location in all of their browsers. And all you have to do is click on that, sign up, and you're now having your privacy compromised by this third party. And so Mozilla has just done some questionable things like that in the past. Now, they still haven't done anything to specifically break my trust, but just like small things like this makes me not trust them a little bit less. And if they can do something like this, then I don't want to have to completely trust them to always have my best interests in mind. I don't care if I'm being paranoid, I just don't want to have to go through the work of researching every company to make sure that they will always have my privacy in the forefront of their hearts. I think a better, more sensible default option is just to not trust anybody by default. I don't want to give you telemetry, I don't want to send any data home, I just don't want you to know anything about me so that it can never come back to bite me. And if you're saying, oh, think about the poor developers, these companies, they did fine before all of this telemetry. You do know that you can still go into the GitHub, open up an issue, and file a bug report, right? Telemetry is not the only way to ever fix applications. So all these big companies will be totally fine without your telemetry, I promise. That's why I don't allow any of these applications to collect telemetry about me. I don't want them phoning anything home. But that's just my personal opinion, and if you're not as paranoid as me, then you don't have to go through as many links as I did. I'm just telling you how I thought about it, and maybe you can put a little bit more thought into this as well and make your own conclusions. So hopefully this will just help you think twice before clicking OK, send a whole bunch of information every time there's a bug in my program to all of these companies.